All right, so you're interested in AI and how it's changing things for software developers. Well, you've come to the right place because we're doing a deep dive into a brand new research paper. It just came out in September 2024, and it's called The Effects of Generative AI on High-Skilled Work, Evidence from 3 Field Experiments with Software Developers. And get this, it involves almost 5,000 developers at Microsoft, Accenture, and, wait for it, a Fortune 100 company. We can't say who, but we'll drop some hints along the way.
It's amazing how they actually ran these experiments right inside these companies. We're talking about real developers working on their everyday projects, but some of them had a secret AI weapon.
Okay, so did this AI thing make them code like crazy or just make things more confusing? Did everybody benefit the same or were there some surprises? That's what we're here to find out.
Before we dive into the results, we should probably clarify what exactly we mean by AI-assisted software development.
Sections 2.1 and 2.2 of the paper get into that. They mostly focus on GitHub Copilot. It's like a super smart autocomplete for your code.
Imagine you're coding away, and this AI sidekick is like whispering suggestions in your ear. It's completing lines of code for you, even writing entire functions based on what it's learned from tons of code.
Wow. So it's not just filling in a variable name. It's like offering up whole chunks of logic. There are other tools like this out there too, right? I'm thinking of Amazon Code Whisperer and Replit Ghostwriter.
Yep. There are, but this research is all about Copilot. And remember, this wasn't just some theoretical thing. They had 1,746 developers at Microsoft, 320 at Accenture, and a massive 3,054 at that mystery company. Section 2.2 kind of hints that it's some big electronics company. The researchers didn't just watch, they actually set up real experiments inside these companies.
Now that's what I call real-world testing. So Microsoft started things off back in September 2022. They randomly gave some developers access to Copilot for 7 months. Then Accenture jumped in July 2023 with a 4-month experiment. And that mystery company, they rolled it out gradually over 2 months. Eventually, everybody got access, but on a random timeline.
And that random timing is super important because it lets the researchers really see the impact of Copilot, like a control group in a science experiment.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, I'm curious how many developers actually used Copilot when they had the chance. You'd think everybody would jump at the chance to have an AI assistant, right?
Well, Section 3 tells a different story. At Microsoft, adoption wasn't as widespread as you might think.
Really? What happened?
In the first 2 weeks, only 8.5% of the developers who were given access actually signed up for Copilot.
8.5%?
Wow.
That's surprisingly low. Did they all miss the email? Sometimes I accidentally send important emails straight to the trash.
Well, maybe. They did send reminders, which got adoption up to 42.5%. But even then, not everyone was using it. And even when the control group finally got access, adoption only peaked at 75.6%.
Interesting. How about Accenture? Did they see something similar?
Accenture actually had faster adoption at the beginning, but then it leveled off around 60%. This difference could be because of different company cultures or the types of projects they're working on, maybe even just because of the developer's own preferences.
So even with a tool that could be a game changer, some people are hesitant to use it. Makes you wonder why. What about that anonymous company?
Well, in that case, everyone eventually got Copilot, but just at different times. This let the researchers see what happened as the AI kind of spread through the team. Pretty clever, right?
Definitely a smart move. But how do you even measure a developer's productivity in the first place? It's not like counting widgets on an assembly line or something.
Right. Sections 2.3 and 4 of the paper talk about the tricky business of measuring developer output. Just counting lines of code doesn't really tell the whole story.
So what did they measure then?
The main metric was pull requests from GitHub, which all 3 companies were using. Basically, a pull request means you've finished a chunk of work. Like finishing a chapter in a book, you're submitting it for review and to be added to the main project.
So it's more about a milestone in the process, not just how much code you write.
Exactly. But they went even deeper, looking at code commits, how often they compiled the code, and even how often the code built successfully.
Wow, they were really looking under the hood. They wanted to understand every part of what a developer does, not just the final product.
Exactly. Of course, there were some statistical challenges, like when the control group at Microsoft eventually got access to Copilot. That can mess things up a bit, but the researchers took all that into account.
So after all that number crunching, did Copilot actually make a difference?
Now, this is where things get really interesting. Section 4.2 gives us the headline, Copilot led to a 26.08% increase in weekly tasks completed. And this was consistent across all 3 experiments.
26.08%. Whoa, that's a big jump.
Is this the beginning of the AI developer era?
Hold on. While the overall trend is definitely positive, it's important to look at the individual results. The impact wasn't the same for everyone. For some, it was statistically significant. For others, less so. So it's not like a magic wand. More like a performance boost that works differently for different people.
That's a great way to put it. It's also worth noting that while Copilot led to more commits and builds, which we see in Table 2, there wasn't a drop in code quality.
So it wasn't just churning out more code, but maybe even better code. That's fascinating. Any ideas why that might be?
They don't go into specific reasons in the paper, but it's a good question to think about.
All right, so we've got this overall productivity boost, but it's not one size fits all. Did the research find any other interesting patterns?
Oh yeah, there's more. Section 5 dives into what they call the experience gap, and this is where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's the twist?
The biggest productivity boost went to the less experienced developers.
Wait, really? You'd think the pros would be the ones squeezing the most out of an AI assistant.
I know, right? It seems counterintuitive. But think about it, when you're learning a new skill, the right tool can make a huge difference.
Yeah, like having training wheels when you're learning to ride a bike.
Exactly, and that's what we see in Figure 2. Younger, less senior developers were more likely to try Copilot and stick with it.
That's so interesting. Any clues as to why that might be? Are the experienced devs just stuck in their ways?
Could be. The research found that less experienced developers were more likely to accept Copilot suggestions, maybe because they're still learning and more open to new ways of doing things.
So maybe Copilot isn't just a tool, but almost like a mentor, guiding these new developers as they learn. That's pretty cool. And that's where we'll pause for now.
Join us for part 2, where we dig deeper into what this all means and explore more findings from the study. So we were talking about how those less experienced developers seem to benefit more from Copilot. Makes you wonder what that means for the future of software development.
Yeah, for real. Is this going to turn the industry upside down? Will junior devs suddenly become super valuable, or will the experienced folks become even more important as they learn to work with these AI tools?
Those are great questions. The research doesn't really make any predictions, but it definitely suggests some big changes could be coming. Imagine if people with less experience could contribute at a much higher level right from the start, thanks to these AI assistants.
That would change everything. How companies hire, how they train people, even how teams are structured.
Exactly. Let's go back to one of the key findings for a second. That 26.08% increase in weekly tasks completed. It's a big number, but I'm curious how consistent that boost was across all 3 experiments.
Yeah, good point. Table 2 in the paper breaks down the results for each experiment. We talked about how Microsoft saw a statistically significant increase in pull requests. But what about Accenture and the mystery company? Were their results as clear?
That's where things get a bit more complicated. Accenture and the anonymous company showed similar effect sizes, meaning the impact was about the same size.
But it wasn't statistically significant.
Right, so while there was a noticeable difference statistically speaking, it could have just been random chance and not because of Copilot.
So how do we make sense of that? One experiment shows a clear positive effect, and the others are kind of fuzzy.
It's important to remember that each experiment was a little different. Different companies, different team sizes, different types of software development. All those things could have affected how developers used Copilot and how their productivity was measured.
Right, like comparing apples and oranges.
Yeah.
And we can't forget those statistical challenges we talked about before, like the control group at Microsoft getting access to Copilot partway through.
Exactly. Plus, the researchers themselves say that a developer's output naturally varies. Some weeks you're in the zone writing tons of code, other weeks you're fixing bugs or planning. It's not a perfectly predictable process.
Definitely not. It's not like you can plug a developer into an outlet and expect perfectly formatted code to come pouring out. There are ups and downs, creative bursts, and then those times where you stare at the screen and wonder why you even do this.
Yep. So while that 26.08% average increase is a nice headline, it's important to look at the details of each experiment to really understand what's going on.
Okay, so we've talked about adoption rates, productivity gains, and the experience gap. What else did these experiments tell us?
Well, they also looked at what kinds of output Copilot was influencing. Remember those other metrics they tracked, like commits, builds, and build success rate?
Yeah, what did they find?
Across all 3 experiments, Copilot led to a 13.55% increase in weekly commits. That's from Table 2.
So they were making changes to their code more often.
Exactly. It seems like with Copilot's help, they could make progress faster, experiment more, and iterate more quickly.
That makes sense if the AI is making them more efficient, like having an extra pair of hands so they can test out ideas and refine their code more quickly.
Exactly. And we see a similar trend with builds, which increased by a whopping 38.38%. This could mean that developers were testing their code more often, which could lead to a faster development cycle overall.
Interesting. So maybe Copilot isn't just speeding up individual tasks, but actually accelerating the whole workflow from writing code to testing and refining it.
That's one way to look at it. And here's the really interesting part. Despite all this increased output, there was no drop in build success rate. That means the code quality didn't suffer, even though they were writing more code more often.
That's a really important point. It addresses that worry that using an AI assistant might lead to buggy or unreliable code.
Right. It seems like Copilot wasn't just helping them write more code, but potentially better code, at least in terms of functionality.
Like having a second set of eyes catching those little mistakes that even an experienced developer might miss.
Yeah. Whether Copilot directly contributed to that higher quality is still debatable, though.
Right. It's a complex issue. This study gives us a glimpse into how AI might be changing things, but there's still a lot to figure out.
Definitely. It's like we're peeking into the future of software development, but we need more research to really understand what's going on.
So what's the takeaway from all this?
We've seen how AI assistants, especially tools like GitHub Copilot, can have a big impact on developer productivity, especially for those who are just starting out.
And it's not just about producing more code, it's about potentially improving quality and making the whole development process faster.
But there are still a lot of unanswered questions. We need to understand the long-term effects of these tools on developer skills, the potential for bias in the AI-generated code, and the bigger implications for the entire software development industry.
For sure. It's a fascinating area to keep an eye on as this technology keeps evolving.
Absolutely. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. Be sure to join us for the final part of this deep dive where we'll continue to explore this amazing world of AI and its impact on software development.
So we're back, and we've been talking about AI and software development, looking at this research paper that analyzed real-world experiments with GitHub Copilot.
Yeah, we've seen how this AI tool can really boost productivity and maybe even make code quality better, especially for those developers who are just starting out.
It's really got me thinking about how AI could completely change the game for software development.
Absolutely. And like with any new technology, there's a lot to learn about using AI the right way.
One thing that stood out to me was that Copilot didn't have the same impact on everyone.
Right. Section 4.1 of the paper talks about how the increase in productivity wasn't the same across the board. It depended on the individual developers and the company they worked for. Some saw big gains that were statistically significant, while others only had small improvements.
And even though overall the trend was positive, we can't forget that Accenture and that anonymous company didn't see those statistically significant changes in their pull request numbers. That's from Table 2.
Exactly. It shows that the context really matters. The type of work, the company culture, even individual preferences, all those things probably play a role in how effective these AI tools can be.
It's not like some magic solution that's going to turn every developer into a coding rock star overnight.
Right. It's a tool, and it needs to be understood and used strategically. And that brings us to another interesting finding. The acceptance rate of Copilot suggestions was all over the place.
You mean figure
Yeah, that one. It showed that developers with less experience were much more likely to accept what Copilot suggested compared to those with more experience.
makes you wonder if the experienced devs were being more picky. Maybe they were spotting potential problems with the AI-generated code that newer developers might miss.
That's definitely possible. The study doesn't say exactly why those acceptance rates were different, but it would be interesting to find out.
Yeah, it would be fascinating to understand what was going through their heads. Are those experienced developers checking every single thing? Or are they just more selective about which suggestions they actually use?
Definitely an important question. It shows how important it is to have human oversight and critical thinking, even as these AI tools get more and more advanced.
It's not just about blindly taking what the AI gives you. It's about using it as a partner,
Right.
learning from it, making sure the final product is up to snuff.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So at the end of the day, this research gives us a really valuable snapshot of how AI is impacting software development right now.
And it's clear that things are changing fast. Tools like Copilot are just the beginning.
For sure, as AI keeps getting better, it's going to have an even bigger impact on how software is designed, built, and tested.
This research is just the start of a much bigger conversation about the future of software development and how humans and artificial intelligence are going to work together.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. We've dug into the data, uncovered some surprising findings, and hopefully made you a little bit curious about the exciting possibilities and challenges ahead.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. We'll be back with more deep dives into the world of AI and software development soon. Until then, happy coding, everyone.